The mother, the grand master of social immersion, joins us today. Through surplus reality, cultural communication, and the ancient roots of immersive experience, we wander through the final frontiers of social engineering. Today, I was reminded of the fact that the immersive revolution is just beginning. I give you Marcia Angel, co-founder of Story Works.
You keep it all very small, and if you listen with your whole body, don't open your mouth. Whereas the Americans talk like that. It's all unconscious, but that's how we affect one another. Playback is all over the world. It's international. So and the sun was shining through their eyes. It wasn't just...
Hi, I'm Nathaniel Sky, the host of the Immersion Nation podcast. Here, the masters of immersive experience create and conjure, muse, and imagine the cultural revolution that is unfolding before us. That is immersive entertainment. Welcome. Marcia, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I am really excited for this conversation. I think that there is a lot of good things in store. As is tradition, we will start off with an easier question. If you could live in any fictional world, what fictional world would you live in?
Well, I would say the world where Lion King lives.
Okay. Why is that?
Is that an acceptable answer?
Oh, 100%.
Why is that? Because actually, I'd have to say it would be the Lion King stage production world.
Okay, yes,
Okay.
certainly.
Versus the film. And that's because the creativity of Julie Tamar and how she took the film and put it on stage is quite outstanding. And it was about how human beings became animals and how human beings became with masks that sat on their heads and how human beings became patches of grass that danced together. So it was a whole field of undulating grass, and the imagination of creating that world of Africa with just one little patch of stage and a handful of human beings. We saw the entire animal kingdom that's on display in Africa come alive before our eyes. And it was quite outstanding.
Yeah, I unfortunately have not seen a live rendition of that show.
It's the best theater production I've ever seen.
But I would certainly like to. I think it would definitely be interesting through the lens of having a cast that was, originally animated animals represented by people, because I think suddenly the lines between like the tendencies of animals and the tendencies of humans, I'm sure would get blurred a little bit and kind of bring up some interesting context there.
Yes, it was very imaginative and colorful, dazzling.
Yes.
I got there. I was so dazzled I couldn't say it.
All right. So, for those who aren't familiar, tell us a little bit about your path with immersion and immersive theater specifically. Theater without a barrier between the audience and the actors or the performers.
Okay, well, I've always loved biography, and I've always loved interaction, interpersonal dynamics. It's kind of natural for me to study interpersonal dynamics, and that led me to become a therapist. And so, but at the same time that I started training to become a therapist, I got involved in an improvisational theater group, and I was a freshman at university, so I was very young. Just turned 18 and had just left home for the first time, and the whole thing was kind of overwhelming. And I started straight away from that first semester doing 15 hours a week for 2.5 years with the same people, a core of about 8 people, and we just improvised our lives together.
That's
And
amazing.
it was very intense and very healing, transforming, wonderful. I did a lot of sound and movement and a lot of body work and a lot of interaction. We created sketches together, and it became the bedrock for my therapeutic work.
Yeah.
So here was this therapy program going on, but in the meantime, there was this wonderful, incredible experience of improvising and just laughing our way through Monday through Thursday. And the university training was almost incidental to what I was learning there.
Yeah, yeah.
And so that kind of set the course for me. And I stumbled across playback theater as part of my training to use drama as a form of psychotherapy.
All right, playback theater. Could you explain a little bit about what that is briefly for those who don't know?
Playback theater originated in the mid-'70s by an American man called Jonathan Fox in upstate New York in the Hudson Valley. And he hit upon it through going to Nepal when he was in his adolescence, I believe, young man, and studying oral tradition. And so he kind of developed this form of improvisational theater, community theater, where people tell personal stories and there's a team of actors and a musician who plays their stories back.
Yeah.
So very much grassroots theater. It's not about your performance. It's about sharing your stories, personal events, real things that happen to you in a group of people, and that the audience creates the performance at any given time by the stories that they tell.
Yeah.
And it's this wonderful blend of art and reality.
And that is, I feel like, very much an underpinning theme to every immersive experience that leverages some form of social rather than, like, say, just pure immersive art, something like Meow Wolf when they don't have actors, where it's very much just the environment. But the second that you bring the social dynamic into it, that interactive dynamic, then suddenly even, and now, of course, playback in that format it's anchored in real stories. But I would argue that even in immersive experiences that aren't based off of real stories, but rather a group, a coordinator, actors working in conjunction with an audience, it still brings in such a different degree of reality to that experience, because that audience, one way or the other, even if they're not being themselves, which is kind of the point, at the same time, they're still being themselves. Parts of who they are inevitably leak through. I mean, that's part of acting. People train for years and years to fully shift into a different character, a different psychology. And so having reality as this anchor point, whether it is something like playback, once again, that's anchored in real stories or even not, I think is a really powerful dynamic, I should say.
Well, when it's not a real story, then it becomes a projective technique where, you're talking about universal stories, or you're talking about thematic stories, or you're talking about stories that are fictional. There's really no such thing. A fictional story is based on a real story at some point.
Yeah.
Because stories, the nature of stories is to do with personal experience. And so whether you make it up or not, if you make it up, it's still part of you because you've made it up. But when you have it grounded in something that actually happened to you, that does dramatically change the way that the people that are all there sharing their stories interact with one another. And so then it adds a different dimension in terms of communication with people.
Yeah.
Rather than just sitting around telling stories that they make up. When it's actually something that actually happened to you, then it touches people on a deeper level, even if the story is superficial.
Yeah.
Because it's so personal. I mean, and you start and you build it up like you would any theater production, where you have, kind of a warm-up phase, and then you get to the main story where there's a climax, and then you kind of wrap it up. And So we start with short stories, little segments, just a word or two about something that happened to you today or happens to you every day, or how you arrived there tonight or to be here, or something quite light. And you just tell it where you are in the audience, to moving to longer stories, and
Right.
you invite the teller to come and actually sit in what we call the teller's chair. And so the audience can see the teller telling the story to the conductor, and the conductor is the person that sits between the audience and the players.
Yeah.
So the audience can see the players on stage, they can see the musician on stage, just off the stage, and they can see the teller just off the stage. So they watch the teller watching their own story.
That is so fascinating, and I had no idea that playback came from, or at least had roots in Nepal, which, for me as someone who has kind of played with meditation, kind of that whole mindfulness culture, not in any kind of religious context per se, but just insofar as trying to use it as an insight to be more present in day-to-day life. The link between Nepalese culture, and I know this isn't all of it, so I refrain from generalizing in that way, but I know that there is a lot of the mindfulness culture originates there. And I think that mindfulness culture and just being like very present and self-aware has this really interesting, and I don't want to say torrid, but to some degree, relationship with acting. And then having this thing being playback, having that relationship with that is just wow. Like that, it makes a lot of sense, retrospectively, of course, but it's just fascinating to me. And of course, it's another tag point to be like, of course, immersive theater, immersive entertainment is in many ways kind of becoming a really large wave at this point in time, but just once again points back to one of the examples of it having been around for thousands of years, but having not been or had the potential to be principal form of entertainment culturally, or at least in this culture, today's culture, for quite some time. And now it suddenly is, which is this kind of magical thing in a lot of ways.
Well, I think that it was alive and well in the mid-'70s in Nepal, because the Western culture has become so complex with its communication and its theater and its drama, and has kind of put the professionals on the stage, and at the expense of people in their ordinary lives entertaining one another. And so I think that the Western cultures were as good at it in earlier times, whereas I don't know what Nepal is like now. I've never been there, but I mean, perhaps they've gotten a little more sophisticated with it too. Whereas if you look at the function of drama in the community, it was really to build community and to mix that creative with the real as a way of practicing life, and as a way of highlighting community group experiences and celebrating them, and also
Remembering them, maybe?
remembering them, and also extracting the significance of them in a group setting. So then it becomes like a group process.
Yeah.
And that creative thread is a really important way to magnify human stories and extracting the value and meaning of them.
Yeah. And I mean, that's in so many ways just kind of this perpetual pursuit in just the course of being alive, doing this being human thing, is trying to find meaning and understand meaning in things. And it's interesting because it's become so decentralized in a lot of ways. I mean, there are 10,000 different places, different people, different inputs trying to tell us stories about how things are happening. But at the same time, it's so decentralized. There's so much input, and there's not like something like theater. I'm trying to think of other things that kind of have created cultural consensus in that way. Theater, storytelling, community, communal cooking, religion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's like that vehicle for making sense of what on earth is going on is now so spread out.
Well, playback is really a mirror.
Right.
That's really the at the heart of it, is that you hear a person's experience, and then you play it back. And the artistic part of it is that you add a whole dimension to it by the way you play it back, that the audience hasn't heard from the teller tell, and the teller hadn't even seen themselves until they'd watched what that group of actors and musicians did with their story.
Right.
And then all of a sudden they're understanding their story and who they are and what happened to them in an entirely different way through the creative process. And that's because creativity accesses the unconscious. And a good playback team will use metaphor and use imagery and will use simile and will use archetypes and will use just moving from the verbal to the sound and movement. You're already operating from the unconscious part of the brain.
Yeah.
And so you're just putting a whole filter on it. You're putting a whole new slant on it, and people just kind of get a mirror of their little snapshot of their story back to them in a way that they'd never even seen before.
Yeah. Because a lot of times, whatever you're processing, whatever you're thinking about, kind of stays within the black box of, subconscious cognition to some degree. And oftentimes, unless you're someone who makes a point of like consistently reflecting or having some kind of outlet like that, it just kind of stays up there and bounces around for a while until it finds its home, hopefully in a good place, sometimes in a not so great place, but.
Well, that's the responsibility of the team to not only give it back in a creative form, but also to give it back in an affirming form.
Yeah, or of a culture, one could argue, which is definitely not something that we see a lot at this present point in time. I would argue there's definitely some of it, but and I always really appreciate our conversations, specifically because you have professional background, so much professional experience, both in psychology and in drama and theater. And I think that while a lot of people who work in theater and entertainment and theatrical things of one variety or another wind up picking up some psychology, because you kind of have to, it's part of the whole thing on an intuitive level, but hearing your perspective as someone who has, the vocabulary, the taxonomy for what's happening at the intersection of those two things is super, super fascinating.
That's nice.
So if we could potentially shift directions real quick, we will move into our Make It Immersive segment. So here we will take your chosen immersive world, said the Lion King, and figure out how to make it an immersive experience, one that has a high level of audience interaction. And I think that it's really interesting that you chose specifically a stage play that is designed to not have that happening. So I have not explored this kind of concept before, but what would you do? How would you create audience engagement through the Lion King on stage?
Well, what I love about it is that it's really down to two things. It's down to singing and dancing, and also what they captured there was the heartbeat of Africa. I've never been to Africa, but I felt like I had been there, and the spirit of Africa, which is so extravagant and so rich. And so I have met many African people, and I've certainly been deeply moved by African American music, and born and raised in Motown,
Right.
to understand soul music. And I think that the Africans have a corner on that. And it comes from Africa and then got filtered through slavery in this country to to end up becoming, something that isn't totally African, but at the heart of it is. So I would encourage people to enter into that vibrancy and enter into that abandonment, and also this encompassing love that just pulsates from people's bodies and also their voices, and their embracing with joy, enormous joy in it. Mm-hmm. And that just kind of sweeps me away into it. And that's my experience of having met African people from the continent, and how they are overcomers,
Right.
And they know how to immerse themselves in the glory of nature and these, huge animals that are just so incredibly powerful that walk around where they walk around, not in a zoo.
Mm-hmm.
and
definitely a very
and then the
different world.
magnitude of the landscape and all of that really sensory, motor, movement, creative thing that goes on,
And I think that it's really
pulsating.
interesting.
Really, it's pulsating.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you bring in culture there, because arguably one could almost think of travel as an immersive experience. I mean, it's certainly immersive. It's not really thought of in the terms of immersive theater or immersive VR, but at the same time, I think that a lot of times there's a cultural context or a social contract of some variety that winds up being the underpinning theme of any given immersive experience. And I do wonder if that lens could be used more so across the board to understand.
It just makes me think of the difference between cultures and how cultures of people express themselves. And I guess for me, then the African culture really stands out in many ways, to do with movement of the body and also expression of the voice and the abandonment, the freedom of it, which is very different than like the Northern European expression. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure it has a lot to do with climate, because if you go back to the immersion of The Lion King, it was that sun that just, on all levels was just shining on you through these people.
Mm-hmm. And so I could picture maybe for the immersive Lion King having maybe the sun not be restricted to the stage, but almost doing it like some kind of hot yoga type of thing, where the actual environment in the entire experience or the entire theater would be much more hot. It would have some kind of sunlight going on up top to make it really bright, to kind of, leave behind the light and dark differentiation of stage and audience. Then, of course, you mentioned singing, and I think that Lion King is something you could totally do that with, because so many people know the songs from Lion King, having grown up with that movie. I feel like there are very, very few things that you could have like a sing-along type of production with. But I wonder if that would be possible with Lion King.
Well, the difference between Sound of Music and Lion King is that people were singing with their entire bodies, and the sun was shining through their eyes.
Yeah.
It wasn't just, the heat of the climate. It was the heat that had penetrated their hearts, and they were reflecting that. And it really was quite significant.
Yeah, so the game would then be figuring out how to get the audience to that point, which is incredibly tricky because, I mean, as you know, as a conductor, as the creator, the orchestrator of an immersive experience, how tricky it can be sometimes to bring people into a space where they're comfortable breaking out of their traditional dialectic, their traditional narrative, and entering something different, or at least a different context.
Yes, absolutely. And yet, if it's infused with so much energy, you'd have to be half dead to not pick up on some of it, Mm-hmm. And there are half-dead people sitting in audiences. I mean, I'm sure spirit blockers, we call them. But they, you can't help but just kind of, move your body when you see other people move. It's and when
mirroring.
Yeah, and also there's this sonic resonance. When people are breathing with their whole beings, as they sing, they are relaxing in it and letting go. That has a mirroring sonic effect on the audience. So a good singer will make the audience feel relaxed and receive what they're saying because they're so good at being in touch with their own breathing and they're enjoying what they're doing. A bad singer who doesn't sing from their diaphragm, they sing from, straining at the neck, so it's above the diaphragm, very short breath kind of, makes you want to cringe. It closes you up, makes you nervous and closed up yourself. So we have that kind of resonance with each other,
Yeah.
So you can really control an environment by your presence, or certainly have an effect on it.
Auditory mirroring. Okay, and I'm not necessarily going to sit here.
Sonic resonance isn't necessarily auditory because there's body sound is absorbed by the body as well, and so there's the low frequencies and the high frequencies. You get you listen with your whole body, and so you put your body in a breathing pattern that the performer is breathing in, and you mirror them, and whatever the performer's body's posture is becomes yours too.
That's so interesting.
It's all unconscious, but that's how we affect one another in the way that we are in ourselves.
Yeah, and I mean, I've never or have only very occasionally thought about the concept of sound and communication outside of the context of just your ears. But I mean, everything is so integrated just physiologically. It does make sense that there would be more components there that your body actually resonates with and understands.
Well, if someone's dancing and they're really fully generating, being this generator of movement, then you find when you're watching them, you start to move as well.
Yeah.
You know, and you're not even aware of it, but their movement, you start to copy with their movement with your body. And so it is with the voice as well.
Many, many layers there. I really love that concept. I think it speaks to how much more there is to explore within immersive theater, because if, as you were saying, kind of like the complication of Western communication took a very different path than that of the kind of social communication in other cultures, other parts of the world, what have you. It makes one wonder if the type of communication that is predominant in our culture right now has become so sophisticated and so complex, and there's even like ways that you can start kind of considering what that looks like as we integrate technology to it. What does that look like on the other mode of communication, the like social communication, I don't even know how to put a delineation between the two concepts, but it is really interesting.
Well, you're talking about space as well. I lived in the UK for 27 years, and coming from the United States, where space is a commodity that's quite free,
right,
and going to Europe, where space is a very costly commodity. There's not a lot of it.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people having to share a very small space. Same with New York City or any other big city. Not any other bigger city, but San Francisco is a very small city. New York City is an island. And so, then you have people having to share space a bit more like a European city. But the expansiveness of being able to take as much space as you need and want, as opposed to having to keep your privacy and your boundaries well intact when someone's sitting right on your lip.
Yeah, certainly.
And so what happens is that even how much you open your mouth when you talk is different. So if you look at how British people talk, they talk with their lips quite pursed, and they don't open their mouths very often.
Yeah.
You don't talk. You keep it all very small, and everything is really, you really don't open your mouth. Whereas the Americans talk like that, their mouths are wide open, and it cringes the ears of the Europeans. It's to do with space, just even the space that you take with your mouth.
Fascinating, and that lines up. Just in some of the traveling I've done out of culture or out of country, with that being very much the perception, especially from people from Europe, that is a big part of the cultural perception of Americans in many ways. And it's it's not super common that conversation will be had directly, but it does happen. But contextually speaking, that perception and understanding of American culture is definitely there.
Yeah, Americans aren't loud in America.
Right.
But they're really loud in Europe. And everybody will tell you Americans are loud. And not only that, but they just take space. So, for instance, I had a family visit me in London, and it was 2 parents and 2 children. And so we got on the train.
Right.
And there are little 6-person carriages, and then there's a 4-person carriage, and then there's 2. And so we got on the... not carriages, but the actual units where you can, configuration of seating. So we got on the one carriage and it was empty.
Right.
So I immediately went, because there were 5 of us, I went to a 6-person seating block, expecting them all to join me. They each took their own block, including, so the mother sat in her own 6-person block next to mine, and Dad sat across the aisle, and the kids wandered off to the other side of the carriage, and just had their own little space, and never even thought twice about it.
Interesting.
They took the whole space, just took it.
Yeah.
Claimed it as their own, unconsciously. Now that would never happen with Europeans. You're used to having to, and it's because the Americans, they do the same thing in restaurants. In Europe, in restaurants, if there's 2 seats on your table, strangers will come and take the seats on your table. And you're going, well, hang on, this is my table.
Yeah.
But
American culture, that's unthinkable.
it's not your table. You got your seat, and there's other seats that you're not using, and they need them, so they use. And then so people get very used to having to sit right next to strangers, and that's why they don't talk to them. So you stand in the line at the supermarket, and you got 10 minutes because there's a long queue. And so in this country, it'd be normal to turn to the person in front of you and just talk about something, just to pass the time.
Yeah.
So talking to strangers is quite normal here, and not in England. Why are you talking to me? I don't know you. Even though we're standing there for 10 minutes, and it'd be kind of nice to pass the time instead of just stand there. But oh no, well, you don't talk to me. I don't know you. Who are you?
And then that's interesting because what is it? I don't know if it's British culture. It's a European culture of that ethos that I've always heard that people love queuing, specifically queuing meaning getting in line, which I find fascinating if you put it into that context. And it's interesting that you say that it's more natural to lean towards extroversion within American culture, because I felt like, say, for instance, when I was down in Costa Rica last year, I felt almost the opposite. I felt like there was like the Americans there, or opposite given the context of being in Central America. I felt like the culture was much more social than American culture on average, and that it was even farther down that line. So I find it interesting that you define European culture as the other end of that. So
I suppose European is a bit broad, because when I went to Ireland, the Irish culture and the Celtic cultures, like the Scottish and the Irish and the Welsh and the Cornish, and are very different than the Anglo-Saxons, who are more in the center of England, and the Celts are on the periphery. And so, but going to Ireland, it was very unbridled, and everybody talked to strangers. It was totally normal. So I said to the man who was our cab driver, I said, wow, this Ireland, first time there, is a lot like being an American. He said, surely you mean that the Americans are like the Irish.
Right. Which actually came first there.
Smaller island in England. So I guess I have to, clarify which part of Europe we're talking about.
Either way, it is a really, really interesting paradigm.
It is an interesting,
So you have did you perform playback in any context when you were living in the UK?
Yes.
Did you see any marked difference in the way that audiences reacted with the format of playback between the US and Europe? Is there any commonalities or trends that you could draw out of that, or that stick out to you?
Well, the beauty of it, of course, is that the playback adapts totally to the audience that they have.
Right.
And so the skill is in making contact with that particular configuration of people, whatever country you're in and whatever situation of people that is gathered.
So maybe any trend in configurations on either side, or in what that onboarding process?
Well, there are, I mean,
typically look
playback
like?
is all over the world. It's international. So there's like probably, by this time, well over 40, 50 countries that do playback. And so I had not just seen, doing it with a Wales team myself, but I've seen different cultures that will play together in training events or, and certainly the Northern Europeans are much more cognitive and verbal, as opposed to the Southern European and African continent being much more physical.
Okay.
And some are more metaphoric than others, just straight, as you heard it is how you play it.
Right. Literal versus using
symbolic,
other kind of symbolic, other forms of language,
which comes with
taxonomy,
more sophistication.
Once again, back to that.
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting thing. I've done playback with children, and they really have difficulty if you don't play it exactly as it was for them.
Interesting.
They cannot handle it if one little bit of it is different. And they'll stop it right there and say, no, that wasn't right. No, you got to say that, not that word. It was that word. And you're going, okay.
Oh my gosh.
And that literalness was so important to them, which is kind of interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, that really is. Now, for people who aren't necessarily familiar with the format of playback as immersive theater, is there anywhere that someone is there an online community or a website, some kind of group of people who don't necessarily have access to playback immediately in their vicinity could find some variety of exposure to playback?
Historically, it's very hard to film playback.
That makes a lot of sense.
And so there are a lot of poor attempts of it on line, which doesn't do it justice.
Yeah, certainly. And that's kind of the thing with immersive experiences. It's incredible. It almost is pointless, or it almost feels pointless at times to try and film them because it doesn't capture what's actually happening.
Well, I think that's, then now we're talking about film as a medium, because I think it's very hard. If you look at how good films are made, they don't just throw a camera on a live event.
Certainly.
It's very different. I mean, you can take 6 hours filming one scene with a camera, and that's how you make it look like it's very real.
Yeah, and playback was organic, whereas the medium of film necessitates a different kind of visual language that oftentimes finds its finest forms in the things or in contexts that are artificially created, because you have to be able to take 50 takes, 20 takes of a given thing. You have to try.
The camera has to catch the same scene of two actors from different physical perspectives, and then you have to edit it, and it's people don't realize.
But of course, you have virtual reality as a thing that's becoming more and more prolific, and it starts to raise the question of, okay, what if something in that format of recording / communication could then open up a world of that? And of course, obviously, I'm still of the mind that you always do lose. I don't want to say something. I feel like you lose a lot insofar as that, but there are definitely instances of people doing immersive experiences just on a phone, just across like Skype or some kind of video call, that actually do still pack an emotional punch and like do really good things and really incredible things for the participants / audience members.
Well, the photographer would have to be part of the team. Just like the musician's role in the playback team is very different than the actor's role. because the musician is the one who creates the soundtrack. The musician's the one that cues in all the action and creates the emotional atmosphere for the audience. So their role is enormously important. So if you were going to film playback, you'd have to have the photographer, the camera person, be part of the team, and that they played the story back with their camera.
You know, I almost wonder if you could do playback on film, and this is kind of almost a callback to the Make It Immersive segment in a way, because this is another bit of speculation here, but I wonder if you could do it with, you know, the team there, but instead of having like an audience spread out, have it be like, okay, if you want to participate in this thing, you have to have somewhere between, I don't know, just throwing it out, 2 to 5 people, because I feel like if you're doing something digitally, in order to have it be emotionally resonant, it has to be a much smaller group usually. At least that's the kind of format that I've seen immersive experiences that do go online one way or the other, taking it, just being like, hey, this is either for one person or just a few people. Otherwise, it loses all context.
Well, then you also get into confidentiality issues, and you also get into issues where it's not scripted. So an audience member has so much to negotiate just on what story they're going to tell and what level of trust they can glean from the team, actors team,
certainly,
the conductor, the musician, and how trustworthy they are to hold someone's personal story.
Right.
That if you add the camera, then that can become very intimidating to people, because the whole idea is that you're inviting people that aren't experienced in performing in any way to enter into.
Oh yeah, that's definitely nerve-wracking.
The beauty of being yourself communally and being yourself in a group of people, you know.
It's a lot of vulnerability to ask from.
It's a lot of vulnerability just to ask someone to come to something they've never experienced before.
Yeah.
Let alone throw a camera in there. And realize that it's going to be magnified so that they have to trust the whole unseen audience that's going to be watching it through the camera, and not just the people that are in the room with them.
Yeah.
You know,
vulnerability, and
that's where professional actors become really good, because they know how to negotiate all that and to be totally real in a role.
Yeah, certainly, and vulnerability and just human error a lot of times is definitely something our culture is not doing super well in the digital space right now. Just insofar as people being ousted, targeted one way or the other, sometimes when someone hasn't actually even said anything wrong, and I'm not even speaking to any specific examples at the moment, but I feel like it's easy for someone who has a lot of eyes on them, and that now can be so many people or anyone at any given point in time, to have a culturally incredibly negative reaction. And I feel like that's something that I think we are collectively trying to get better at the moment. But right now it's definitely a thing that's very top of mind to many people. So would you be down to enter into a little bit of rapid fire? And I have just a few kind of faster questions to go through here as we start coming to the end of our time.
Sure.
All right. So first, what is one immersive experience that you're particularly excited about the potential of? I don't know how much exposure that you've had to things like Meow Wolf or the wider world, but you can take this in any direction that comes to mind.
I would call it's a psychodrama term called surplus reality.
Okay. Oh, surplus reality. I like that. I like that a lot.
And that's where you create and allow the team of people, the group of people with you, to create something that hasn't happened to you, but that you would want to have happen to you. So you're moving into your imagination, and it's still personal. I'll give you an example. Mm-hmm. So I did a piece of work with a team of psychodramatists. It was a training thing, and so all these people were really good at what they did. They were all, and yet they were now just becoming group members. Mm-hmm. And So the man who was directing it was a very highly acclaimed psychodramatist from Argentina.
Okay.
And I didn't think that I would get a chance to be the protagonist and do my own work.
And sorry, just for reference for anyone who's listening, do you by any chance remember the name of the director in that situation?
Yes, his name was Dalmiro Bustos.
Excellent, excellent. And we'll put that in the show notes for anybody who's interested in looking up him or any of his work or this particular instance.
He's from Argentina. And Bustos means breast, of course. Bust, breast.
Okay.
Bust, same word, Bustos, bust. Anyway, so he said, well, you know, what do you want to do? I got chosen by the group to be the protagonist, so I got to take the space, and I was just amazed with this very highly skilled and highly respected team of people.
Right.
Top of their game, you know, starting with the director. And so I said, well, you know, I feel like I could trust you with anything. And I feel like I want to go somewhere I've never been before.
Right.
I'd like to meet my unborn daughter.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
And he said, without batting an eye, okay. And off we went.
Right.
Now that's surplus reality. It hasn't happened. You know, usually you put on the stage a situation where you have conflict or a situation where you need to examine your dysfunctional role that is causing you to not be able to function very well. And that's where the therapeutic healing part of it comes, is that we operate on the role and try to retrain roles and practice living in a more healthier way.
Right, right.
But this was just like it never happened. And more than that, was not likely to happen because my husband and I are not able to have our own children. We're not able to have our own children. So I was struggling with what would it be like to have a child that was, you know, me and Billy together.
Yeah.
And it was all in surplus reality. It was all in my imagination and would never be anywhere else,
right,
as far as I understood. And so to be able to, so the beauty of it is that the woman who brought psychodrama to the UK, her name is Marcia Karp.
Okay.
And she spells her name the same way as me, Marcia.
Right, right.
And so when Dalmiro said, who can be your unborn daughter? I said, Marcia.
Right, okay, yeah,
and so,
of course.
The technique is that you role reverse with the auxiliary. The auxiliary is the people you choose in the group to play the different roles in your drama. So my unborn daughter was obviously an auxiliary role. So there's Marcia and I being mother and daughter.
Yeah.
And the director gets you to reverse roles. So then I had to be my daughter and she had to be me.
Yeah.
And then because you do everything from the perspective of, my perspective is my story.
Right.
And that's how you do it, so that you get my information from both roles.
Yeah.
So I was showing everybody what my unborn daughter looked like by being her. And then Marcia would get her cues from what she'd seen me do and step into it and take it further. And so we're gazing, I'm holding her in my arms, and you know, this big woman, and gazing into her eyes, and I said to her, "You're so funny." And she said to me, now a good auxiliary, you don't have to keep reversing because they kind of know exactly what to do because they're so tuned into you that they know how to play it.
Right.
And she'd say, no, you're the funny one. You're really funny.
Yeah.
And so we had this little thing back and forth about, you know, who's the funny one and where did the funniness originate? With the child or with the mother? And here I am, you know, having this immersive experience of holding my daughter in my arms, who I'd never met before, you know. And so afterwards, when we were processing it, Dalmiro said that little scene there, and at one point he, as the director of the drama, got confused about who was in what role at a certain point.
Right, yeah.
And so he had to kind of ask. And he said afterwards that was not a mistake on his part or anyone's part, that he got confused. He said because he'd never seen a more perfect example of symbiosis between a mother and a daughter than he was seeing acting out right there.
Oh, amazing.
And symbiosis, of course, is a stage of development with the mother and child where you are one and there's no separation between you and your...
Where that connection, that maternal bond is just so strong at that point in time. Yeah.
But it's also a very, very young development. So it's like 2 months to 5 months of age.
Right.
And, and then it moves into separation where the child at 6 months of age begins to understand that they're not part of mommy, that they're a separate person.
Right.
And that separation begins. So we were caught in that symbiotic stage.
That is absolutely
where
incredible.
You didn't know who was mother and who was daughter.
Mm-hmm.
And did I answer your question? Or are you immersed in the symbiosis of the story?
I am certainly immersed in the symbiosis of the story. I feel like this entire episode has been a multitude of really incredible tangents, and I'm glad that it has been very much that, because we have went in so many directions that I did not expect to go by any stretch of the imagination, but I think we have explored parts of immersive entertainment, I refrain from even wanting to restrain it to the concept of entertainment after this conversation that I haven't thought about at all, and is interesting because I haven't encountered most of these concepts in the context of what is happening with a lot of the rest of the world of immersion, which once again is incredibly, incredibly young, or at least young in its current form, young in its rebirth, so to speak. And it serves as a really incredible reminder of how much more there is to the story of that kind of experience, that kind of communication, that there's so much undiscovered and unexplored. I haven't even heard the term psychodramatist referenced inside of the rest of immersive theater, which I find fascinating, because it's like from what you're explaining, there's a very long, rich, highly studied, highly skilled discipline behind this stuff, and I haven't seen it enter the sphere. I'm sure it's there. I'm sure one way or the other, it has a high degree of potential that I just haven't discovered it or encountered it yet, but that is truly fascinating. Well, I would just like to say...
That wasn't a rapid one, was it?
No, that's totally fine. That's totally fine. Once again...
I'll have to practice that one.
Such is the natural flow of conversation. Well, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate you taking the time, of course. I very much hope that we can have you on at another point in time as the world of immersion grows and as my understanding of immersion grows. So hopefully I can pick out some interesting concepts, and they're all interesting concepts, but concepts that are particularly attached to things that are happening in the world of immersion. So either way, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And of course, links to everything that we discussed in the show can be found at immersionnation.com/podcast. And until next time, thank you for listening. Calling all immersive adventurers, explorers, connoisseurs, and artists. The immersive revolution is just beginning. All that is to say, we would love any feedback that you might have on the show. What do you want to hear more of, less of? Anyone in particular you'd like us to have on the show? I would love to hear your thoughts. So please rate us, review us, or just drop us a line on the website at immersionnation.com. I always love having conversations about this wide and wild world that we are both living in and creating. Once again, this is the Immersion Nation podcast. Thank you for joining us in this adventure.